Greetings, YouTube. Vulnerable, entitlement, diversity, transgender, fetus, evidence-based, science-based. Yeah. The current administration is simply trying to erase these words from discourse by the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. So that means they don't want anyone talking about how these words are connected to diseases, physical and mental, in America and at the world at large. So let's take a look at these words. First, we've got vulnerable. Now, you can't deny that there are certain communities and certain groups of people that are vulnerable to certain diseases and issues in ways that other groups are not. That's just the way it is. Sometimes it's genetic, sometimes it's social. For example, homeless people are vulnerable to certain diseases that your average person that lives in a home is not. In fact, I'm reading a book right now that talks about how parasites can affect homeless people in ways that they're never going to affect a person who has access to the full regime of hygiene and clean clothes and clean sheets and things like that. So the word vulnerable means that you cannot just not discuss that particular concept. Next, we have entitlement. Now, entitlement always is a hot button issue for a lot of the GOP base because they think of the word entitlement as giving things to people who don't deserve them. But no, entitlement exists because you are entitled to them. You were entitled to your Social Security, for example. You were entitled to your medical coverage after you reach a certain age or if you fall into certain social categories. You are entitled to that because you and society at large has paid into a fund to make sure that you have that money later. It is yours. It does not belong to the GOP base. It does not belong to the Democratic base. It does not belong to anyone other than you. You are entitled to it. But the administration of the Orange Menace doesn't want us talking about that as it pertains to disease and mental health and physical health. No. Can't do that. That's not allowed. Next, we have diversity. So the administration of the Orange Menace doesn't want us to discuss the fact that diversity, many different ethnicities and social groups and religious groups existing in the world at the same time, is reality. They would prefer to only discuss things in a certain frame of reference. And that frame of reference looks a whole lot like me. Really, really white dude. Because that is the image of America that the GOP base is selling. That only real Americans are white. And if you aren't white, if you aren't straight, then if you're not cisgender, then you're not a real American. You're one of those other people. And we can ignore the other people because they're not us. That's the narrative you push when you erase the concept of diversity. Now, it would be different in other countries. For example, in Burma right now, they're pushing the narrative that the Rohingya are others and we can just exterminate them and the world will sit back and watch us do it as entertainment. Transgender. So the Orange Menace's administration would just like to erase that concept from conversation. They don't want us talking about transgender people. We're just gonna right off the screen, so you can't see them. It might even be more convenient if we like put them in one of those rooms over there that says a door. It's a little room where you store things. You put coats in there sometimes. If we put them in that room right there, then that would be even more convenient for us. And that way their misery and their suffering because society treats them like shit, we won't have to see that. Yeah. That's what we'd like to do. So we're just not gonna mention transgender people anymore. Fetus. This one is kind of amazing because the GOP base loves to talk about fetuses. But they usually refer to them as unborn children or babies. And those are not what they are. They're a fetus. Until it leaves the womb, it's a fetus. is not an unborn child or the unborn. Those are nonsense terms, but they're emotionally loaded. And the administration of the Orange Menace would rather have people use emotionally loaded terms that benefit their particular narrative as opposed to just talking about it in a clinical manner, which is somewhat strange because, the CDC should really be discussing things in a clinical manner because, the D part of CDC and all. All right, and then the last two terms, evidence-based and science-based, they're going to roll those up into one little discussion here. That is a means of keeping the CDC from discussing things like vaccinations, evolution, proper types of treatments for people. And I actually heard a bit of buzz on the news about this, and they like that the GOP administration would prefer terms, discussing like science, guided by community standards. Well, guess what? That's bullshit. You're entitled to an opinion, you aren't entitled to your own facts. And science-based and evidence-based science is all about facts. And if the science tells you that water is wet, and if you drop an object, it will fall, your community standards about those two concepts are not going to change the fact that water is wet and things fall when you drop them. That's just what happens. So removing those terms is to literally endorse willful ignorance. Now, all of this discussions I've had right here, right now, all of this is discussing political correctness in its most naked form. This is totalitarianism in its most basic concept. This is how you build the foundation of totalitarianism, is by deciding that these words can't be used. We would want you to use these words instead, because we're trying to frame the narrative through our lens and making sure that people outside that narrative are never even seen. This is newspeak, Orwellian newspeak here. And who is doing it? The GOP. So America seems to be just fine with this concept. But if you change the language to treat other people with decency and respect, well, now we can't have that now, can we? We can't treat people with decency and respect. Screw that. But if you want to change the language to hide reality, well, that's just prudent. This is the evil nature of social conservatism. Right here, folks. The elimination of other people because society has decided that they're inconvenient, the vulnerable, transgender people. Concepts that might help all of us in some way, shape, or form. This is Orwellian newspeak. And the administration of the Orange Menace is committing it right before our eyes. And the GOP base is lapping it up off the ground. Because they love ignorance. Because social conservatism is founded on ignorance and fear. And this kind of language helps to foster ignorance and fear. So use these words whenever you can. Make sure the world doesn't forget that they exist and how they're used. Because I'm not sure what we're going to do if they can destroy the language itself.